Welcome back. In this video I'm going to continue talking about data types, specifically Booleans in this video. So let's get started. Looking at this screen here, I have three values here defined and they are considered false, and I have a couple variables here and they all have a value of true. It's important to understand that these are the only three values, A, B, and C, are the only three possible ways that something can be considered false. It either has been declared to be false using the keyword, it has a value of 0, or it has a null value. These are the only three ways. Every other value that is not one of these three is always going to be considered true. And so it's really impossible to cover every possible true value because it's unlimited. I mean, there are literally millions of possibilities of something that is not one of these three values. Everything from a name to a number to a resource ID, and the list goes on. They're always going to be considered true unless it's false, 0, or null. So letter A is true, 1 is true, -1, whatever this value is, it's a very small decimal number, or even something like a character, like a $sign. These are all considered true because they're not false, they're not 0, and they're not null. So as long as you can understand these three and memorize them, you can just say, hey, is it one of those three? If it's not, it doesn't matter. It's going to be true. Now, down here I have an if statement, and we're saying if A is true, echo it's true. If it's not, then do this instead. Else, echo it's not true. This is how we make decisions in programming. We ask if something is true, and if it is, then we do something. If not, we do something else. And that's why we have the else statement. So just like we use the print function, if you ever do that, which technically isn't a function, but if we say print, we give it the parentheses, and we give it a string inside of those parentheses. You technically don't even need the parentheses, but that's just a little bit of information there. But the point is that we're saying if whatever is inside of these parentheses here, we're giving it some data to operate on, to evaluate. And if it's true, we do this stuff, and if not, we do this. We'll talk a lot in detail about the ifs in the else statements. So don't worry about completely understanding everything right now. But again, the important thing is to understand that right now we've declared A to be false. So if we print this out to the screen, we're going to see it's not true. If I go to Z, and we view that in the browser, we see it's true. Z has a value of A. A is considered true. If we do W, it will also be considered true. And nothing changes. If I go back up here and I try B, which has a value of 0, and we view that in the browser, it changes to it's not true because 0 is considered false. Oftentimes we will not necessarily be evaluating an assigned value like we have here, but we will be using some kind of a function that returns a value. And the value that it returns will either be 0 or null or something like that. If we go to the PHP documentation, which I'll go there now just to give you an example of this, I'll say php.net/fwrite. If you look at the definition of this function, it tells us the name of the function and the parameters that we give it. If you've never looked at one of these, this whole part that's highlighted with a print function, since I've been using that in the other videos, you can see it returns, or this takes a string data type as its only argument. So we give it a string inside of these parentheses. And print returns an integer. Going back to the fWrite function, it takes a resource handle, you don't have to know what that means, and it takes a string value as its second parameter, and then inside of these square brackets indicates that there's an optional length attribute that you can give it. So whereas we were giving it just a string as its only parameter, here we give it two parameters and we separate them by commas. And this also returns an int. But to stick with the print function, I'll give you an example here. We'll say print oops, I don't need that semicolon there. So I've given it a function inside of this if statement, inside of these farthest outside parentheses. View this in the browser. It says it's true because it's printing out something. It's returning a 1 indicating an integer, indicating that it was able to print out something. So we see what it printed out, and because it was successful in printing that, we then go into that statement and say, hey, it's true. I did print something. I don't know if this will work. I've never actually tried this, but I get an error by not giving it anything. But if for some reason it was unsuccessful in printing, other than not giving it anything in this case, it would indicate that it's not true, and I don't know how to get it to print nothing and return false. Either way, the point is we can use functions here inside of an if statement to declare a true or false value. We can declare it in methods such as this, but again, the most common way is you will use some kind of a variable like result, and we'll have some kind of a function here, and it will return some kind of a value, and it'll store that value in the variable, and then we'll test that variable, and we'll say if it's true that, you know, whatever that function, you know, if that function actually took place, if it was successful. If it's true, then we'll give it some code here. One example might be if we have a function here that checks a database or a database for a username and password, and we're going to check the results because it's going to find one row with one username and one password, so it returns one row if it's successful. If there's only one copy of that same username and password that matches, it's going to return 1, and so we say, hey, if it was true, if it's successful, in other words, if it found a result for that username and password, well, then log them in. If not, then, you know, give an error message that it was unsuccessful or bad username and password. So I hope that this makes sense. I try to spend a little bit more time on this than the other two videos because it's important to understand true or false values so that we can make decisions and actually do something useful with our code. So check out the next video, the last one on arrays.